Welcome to week 7 of HI 3284, and this is a really great week in this subject. It's going to be very useful to you in your futures, because this week we're looking both at how to use images and how to navigate copyright on images. So we'll have a look at what images can tell us about the past, how historians might use images, what we need to know about them to make sense of them. We'll do some of that in the workshop this week as well. And following that, we're going to look at what we need to know to use the images in anything that we might be publishing, even online. So we'll look at copyright, at the legislation that you need to be aware of, and at how you might be able to use images, particularly for that final piece of assessment. And again, we'll be working on that in the workshop this week. So plenty to be getting on with. Here are those things that we're looking at again. We're looking at images and how we can use them, and also how we should be suspicious of them. We're looking at the technicalities of how we use them when communicating history as opposed to when constructing history. So when can we use images? What guidelines are there around copyright? And when we talk about using images to communicate, we need to move as well beyond just the technicalities of can we reproduce this image or not, and consider when images are worth 1,000 words and when they're not. Images are becoming ubiquitous, and reproduction of images, including in colour, is becoming really cheap. It's cheap to print comparatively, and it's really cheap to put things up online. And we're seeing more images in books, in magazines, in journals, and on websites expressing history. But I think this requires care. We still have to have the language and the skills to adequately analyze images and to express our findings. There's a risk that with this availability of pretty coloured pictures, images in historical research become mere wallpaper and don't convey meaning in any real way. We also need to spend time making sure we communicate what we see in a picture. There's that saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And we may think something is obvious in an image when to another person looking at it, it simply isn't there. We can't expect that images will strike others in exactly the same way that they strike us. As historians, we need to consider captioning, and we need to make sure that we don't expect pictures to speak for themselves, because pictures don't have words. We need to find ways to explain what we are seeing in an image and make sure that an audience we're communicating with can see it as well. And sometimes we've got expertise, which means we see things in images that a normal person just misses. We need to think about taking our audience along with us when we're looking at images and when we're using them in our work. And one of the things we need to be aware of when we're analysing images and when we're taking our audience along with us is that images are constructed texts. We need to treat them with caution, just as we treat any other text, any other source that we look at. And this is true of photographs as well as of more obviously constructed images. Cameras might be described as the mirror with a memory, but as you know from our week on oral history, memory has its issues. No image is utterly objective. Photographs are framed, or at least good photographs are carefully framed. And if you're not thinking about what is in the background when you're taking a video or making a photograph, you really should be. And let me state that again in case any of you are so inspired by my videos about the various archives around Townsville that you wish to make your own. Think about your backgrounds. Tidy up if necessary. Move the odd chair to make the place look nicer. Find views that look appealing and that promote a sense of orderly space and a rich collection, because then the people who operate the collection will allow you to release it online. And this is true not just of videos in the modern period, but of photos throughout the history of photography. And photos are often staged as well. They're carefully arranged an audience is gathered, and that audience may then become part of the photograph itself to make the event that it's capturing look important. This week, in terms of watching a video, I'm not asking you to take a tour of an archive around our local area. Instead, I'm asking you to watch a video from an exhibition that was held at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. That video looks at the techniques that were used to fake photographs before the modern era of faking using Photoshop. And it should make you question the authenticity of photographs in general, rather than trusting to old photographs as truthful representations of the past. The image on this slide is one that I would like you to look at and be extremely skeptical of. It does represent a truth, it gives you interesting information, but the way it's presented is as an objective photograph, and there are so many things wrong with it as an objective photograph that I would like it to be setting off all your alarms. Look at the things that are wrong. Looking at this, I hope you realize immediately that it must be a composite image. The world is not all dark at any one time. Similarly, it is extremely unlikely that the world will be completely cloudless at any one time. Then there's the issue of projecting a three-dimensional object onto a two-dimensional space. Why is this map centered on the Atlantic? How is it flattened to produce a rectangle from a sphere? What does that mean for the distortion of the image that we're seeing? And the caption adds another level of meaning to this image as well. That term black marble is evocative of an earlier image, the blue marble image from 1972, which was the photograph of Earth taken by the crew of Apollo 17. That's a very significant image in terms of the environmental movement and of shifting perceptions of the planet. And calling this image a black marble is evoking the significance of space flight and the opportunities it provides in seeing our planet in a different way. Talking about this image this way, I hope makes you see it as a text, and a text that is open for analysis rather than simply a statement of fact. And that's how I want you to see images. And there are a whole lot of image texts for you to interpret. On this slide, there's a list of some of the types of images that interest historians, but it's certainly not exhaustive. And all of them need to be interpreted as texts, not as perfect portals into the past. And these categories are huge. I've lumped paintings together into a single category. But there's a wide range. Some are cheap, some are mass-produced, some are expensive and exclusive and large, some are religious, some are landscapes, some are portraits of livestock. And many of them can tell us things about their creators and their consumers and the world that they live in. Prints are an interesting one because they tend to be cheaper and they can be ephemeral. Sometimes prints can serve to jerk historians back face to face with their subjects to find out that they don't really like them. I had this experience teaching in HI 2001 when I was looking for prints about revolutions. I did find images of farting samurai, but I didn't track down all the images that I'd hoped for from the French Revolution. I've seen them, showers of turds, scatological humour. Seeing them the first time jerked me back face to face with the fact that these revolutionaries weren't people who thought or acted like me, no matter how much I might admire some aspects of their philosophy. Possibly I didn't have the right keywords to search with, but I don't want to think about that too hard. Just to note that images might not be a perfect portal into the past, but sometimes they can disrupt us in our relationship with people in the past and force us to reconsider again our views of certain periods. And so those ephemeral, rough, personal types of images can be extremely useful to historians. Images are becoming more widely available in the present because humans value them. And humans in the past valued them as well. They might have been more difficult to reproduce, but they were reproduced. They're out there and they can tell us things. This image, dating from 1913, tells me some things. And again, it has served to jerk me back to facing the reality of the past. This looks like a bloated animal, and it might be tempting to dismiss it as a fantasy rather than a representation of a real beast. Looking into artwork about livestock, though, the artists were very careful in their representations of beasts and of prized animals that were highly valued by their wealthy owners. This is what the Durham white ox actually looked like. Although this particular image is a little bit of a relic of the past in the time it's created. Animal fashions changed before this. Really, this beast belongs more to the 1860s than to the 1910s. And livestock portraiture brings me back to the point that people in the past did value images and did find ways to overcome the cost of producing them. There are an awful lot of images of fat cattle and fat sheep. And discussing that history of livestock portraiture has no doubt triggered thoughts of how images aren't simply on the surface, and you need to understand their context in order to extract information from them fully. When dealing with images, we do need to know things about them. We need to have a sense of when they were produced. What kind of production were they? Were they for mass consumption? Were they expensive and exclusive in their production? What are they depicting? And what did that mean at the time? I'm talking about how these animals were highly valued by their owners, but there can be a whole lot of other context as well. And what's quite curious are images which in the present are not at all shocking, but in the context of their own period really were. We need to have that sense of context to understand what the image is conveying to its intended audience, because generally its intended audience is not us. I've already made the point that images are texts, and as texts need to be treated with caution. Artists are generally looking to make something that's pleasing to the eye or that is going to please their customer or patron. Artists as well are not necessarily always strictly truthful. And I'm sure we've all had that experience of trying to create a photograph which is the best representation of some kind of reality possible, not necessarily a representation of everyday reality. And just as with online sources, despite this wealth of imagery that's available to us now, we need to remain aware of what is not there, of the absences in the record, and how to assess whether we're getting the full story or only part of it. Images help us write history, but they also help us communicate history. I can't take you through detailed copyright law, and generally you won't need to consult a lawyer. There's a lot of help available dealing with copyright. Make use of that help, because you do need to be alert to requirements. With the ease of reproducing images, it's very tempting to reproduce images and to reproduce images that perhaps we don't have rights to. Australian copyright law changed in 2019, and copyright law varies with jurisdiction. There is help available. In Google, it's possible to restrict image searches to items that have Creative Commons licenses, and that can be very helpful, although that search function is not infallible. It will eliminate some items that it is possible to use, and you still need to use caution with the items that it does suggest are available. For items within collections aggregated by Trove, there's generally a button to click on which will tell you whether or not it's possible to reuse that item. Often things can be viewed, but they're for study purposes only. They're not to be reproduced. I should note, in defense of myself and my colleagues, and if you're going into teaching, this is useful for you to know as well, copyright law does recognize education as a reason to reuse an image that's covered by copyright. As an educator, I can reuse limited portions of copyright material, but only for educational purposes. But really, as an educator, that only covers me in the classroom, and I tend to operate extremely cautiously. And caution is wise because copyright law can be really weird. Music is one that is very awkward to deal with because there are different copyright restrictions on its different component parts. For a particular piece of music, copyright on the music itself may rest with one person, on the lyrics with somebody else, for the performance with the people actually performing it. In print material, there can be different copyright restrictions on the content versus the typesetting. Many works of literature are out of copyright. That's why there are so many Jane Austen mashups around the place. The words can be reproduced at will, but you cannot simply take a published version of a Jane Austen book and reproduce it without care for copyright. The typesetting on that work belongs to the publisher and is covered by copyright. The content, copyright free, the layout, still in copyright. And that splitting can occur for things like the letters from Princess Diana to James Hewitt, which was sold some decades ago, but I still remember the issue. There, Princess Diana's letters were being auctioned. The buyer could buy them, the buyer could read them, but the buyer could not reproduce them because the buyer only owned the physical object. The buyer did not own the copyright on the words produced on that physical object. Copyright requires caution, but having said that, there are many images available. Copyright is automatic. It doesn't need to be explicitly claimed or registered to exist, but it can also be waived. At present, Creative Commons licenses are a way for people to indicate that they're happy to have their work reproduced by others, and creators can waive copyright freely if they wish to do so. For example, my slide backgrounds in this subject come from an image which was released by the BBC. As COVID kicked off and Zoom backgrounds became a thing, the BBC generously made available images of sets from various of its productions. As a result, I can use this background. In addition, I have substantially altered the background. I've picked up on a detail of the background that was released. I have altered the shading, color saturation, that stuff. I could also claim that even if copyright had not been waived, I was using this in an educational setting. But since that particular background isn't of itself contributing to my educational message, I think that, along with the claim to have substantially altered it, probably wouldn't clear me if the creator hadn't waived copyright. In short, be cautious about copyright, but also be aware that there is considerable generosity. Copyright does expire. There are situations in which it is less restrictive than it might be, and it can be waived by the creator. And images certainly can contribute to communicating history effectively. They can be meaningless. I'm sure you've all seen texts where there's a portrait which might as well not be there except to take up space. Or perhaps that's simply that I'm bad at reading people. However, in other texts, images advance the argument extremely effectively, and particularly images with good captions advance the argument that's being put forward elsewhere in the text. Images can illustrate a point that's being made, and they can illustrate quite complex arguments in ways that are easy to understand. That idea tends to be about reproducing a primary source image within a text with a caption. Digital images, infographics, animations can offer an opportunity to communicate in ways that text can't quite manage. I've put up a couple of examples here for you. If you have a look at the image showing the spread of modern humans across the planet, and then look at the video of that same information, the impact, for me anyway, is quite different. Similarly, that second example, watching the plethora of nuclear explosions, seeing how different nations are setting off nuclear bombs in response to each other. It's quite different from seeing a still map of all the nuclear explosions that have occurred. And if you are talented and communicating history is becoming more conversant with the way that images and animations can support the communication of significant ideas. It's important to keep an eye on this too, because in your final piece of assessment in this subject, you do need to include between 2 and 6 images and caption them appropriately. I hope this has given you something to think about, even if I've given a lecture on using images, which includes a grand total of 3 images. We'll look at more in the workshop, and we'll deal with those sticky issues of interpretation, captioning, and copyright.